Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're heading into Asian empires between 1500 and 1700. We've got excerpts from this really cool university-level history textbook. It's going to be wild.
Yeah, so we're going to see how Russia, China, and Japan all dealt with, well, kind of like the beginning of globalization, all the pressures and the power struggles they had to deal with.
Yeah, and like how they kind of set the stage for the world we know today, right?
Yeah.
So much happened back then. Okay, so let's get started.
Sounds good to me.
Russia.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think about, right? This huge empire. It all started with this like medieval Slavic state, Kievan Rus.
Kievan Rus. Yeah, and get this. The princes of Moscow were under Mongol rule for centuries,
Wow.
And as the Mongols got weaker, those princes, they saw their chance, and they got out from under their thumb in 1480.
That's when things get interesting.
Yeah, for sure. That's when Ivan III shows up. Ivan the Great. He wasn't just some conqueror, though.
He was more than that.
Oh, yeah. He was so strategic. Like, he was building a new Russian identity, religious ideas, Asian and European influences, politics. He got the boyars, the nobles on his side, and after Byzantium fell, he basically made Russia the protector of Orthodox Christians. The church loved him.
Wow, so he really set the stage for Russia to become like this major player.
Yeah, definitely.
And then you've got Ivan IV. Ivan the Terrible.
The Terrible, although, our text here says terrible should be formidable.
Formidable.
Yeah. It's like history, it's always told from a certain perspective, right? Oh. Terrible, it makes you think of all the brutal stuff he did, which he did, but formidable shows that, yeah, he was ruthless, but also he was really good at getting what he wanted. Centralized power, more land for Russia. He called himself Tsar, cracked down on the serfs, made allies with groups like the Cossacks.
He sounds like a pretty intense guy. Like, even his personal life was dramatic, right?
Yeah.
All those wives. Maybe 6, maybe 8.
Yeah.
And didn't he kill his own son?
Yeah, there are stories. But that's a deep dive for another day. Anyway, when Ivan the Formidable died in 1584, Russia went into the time of troubles.
Time of troubles? What is that?
Basically chaos. Everyone fighting for power, almost tore the empire apart. But then the Romanovs came along, Michael Romanov.
The Romanovs. They're like synonymous with Russia, right?
Totally. And under them, Russia kept expanding. They took over parts of Ukraine and pushed east. By the end of the 17th century, they'd conquered Siberia, all the way to the Pacific. Tons of resources, especially furs.
So Siberia wasn't just about land, it was about money.
You got it.
But that must come at a cost, right? Socially.
Right, think about it. In 1649, they made serfdom official. Peasants were tied to the land. Landowners had all the power. Super rigid social hierarchy.
Yeah, it's like a trade-off, right?
Right.
More wealth and power for the empire, but less freedom for the people.
Exactly.
And they didn't even stop there. Religious tolerance. Everyone had to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy.
It was all about control. Keep everyone on the same page. Reduce the chance of rebellion. But of course, it created resentment. And that kind of conflict, well, it's a big part of Russia's story, even today.
So there's a pattern, right? Expand, take control, and use some pretty harsh measures to keep that control. It's kind of scary.
Yeah.
But it shows how Russia was making its mark on the world.
It definitely shaped their ambitions. And, even today, Russia still relies heavily on its natural resources. And the effects of serfdom and that rigid social hierarchy, they still influence their politics and their society. It's fascinating.
It really is. Okay, so while all that's going on in Russia, China's entering a new era, the Ming Dynasty. Think amazing palaces, trade booming, and these scholar officials running the show.
The Ming Dynasty, they really brought China back to life after Mongol rule. And their symbol of power, the Forbidden City in Beijing.
Okay, yeah, the Forbidden City.
Huge palace complex, almost a city within a city. 10,000 rooms.
Yeah.
All about showcasing the emperor's power.
Wow, so it's not just big, it's like designed to make you feel small compared to the emperor.
Yeah. You got it. Squares within squares, each one representing more power, more privacy. The closer you got to the center, where the emperor lived, order, hierarchy. The emperor at the very top.
I love that. Like, the design of the city is like a map of their whole worldview.
Yeah, and inside those walls, you had these scholar officials running things, not your average bureaucrats.
Oh.
They had to pass these crazy hard exams, all based on Confucian texts. They had to be super smart, A&D, totally steeped in Chinese values.
So it wasn't just about who your family was, but what you knew.
Exactly. It was about merit. At least in theory. Totally different from Europe at the time, where it was all about, who your parents were.
But even with all this peace and success, the Ming Dynasty couldn't forget their past, right? I mean, the Mongols. They must have been worried about another invasion.
Oh, yeah. That fear. It led to one of the most impressive things humans have ever built. They expanded and strengthened the Great Wall of China.
They added to it. How much?
3,800 miles of new walls to a structure that was already thousands of miles long. Some say the total length during the Ming Dynasty, maybe over 13,000 miles, longer than the whole U.S. coastline.
That's just, I can't even wrap my head around that.
Yeah, they were serious about protecting themselves.
Okay, so they had these huge projects, but what about, like, everyday people? How did they live?
The Ming Dynasty, they were all about stability and prosperity for everyone. They planted tons of trees to prevent erosion and help with farming. They moved people around to different regions to boost agriculture, and they encouraged trade. Silks, paper, even tobacco.
Tobacco? Wait, wasn't that from the Americas?
It was.
So even though they were building this huge wall, they were still connected to the rest of the world, at least a little bit.
They were. It's interesting, right? Russia's expanding its empire, Japan's shutting itself off, and China's kind of doing both. It's like each empire had a different playbook for dealing with, the world getting smaller.
That's what's so cool about studying history. You see all these different approaches, all these choices, and how they shape the world we know today.
You said it. And there's so much more to explore. But I think that's a good place to stop for now.
Okay, so we've seen how Russia and China were, like, dealing with the whole globalization thing in their own ways.
Right.
Expanding, consolidating power.
Right.
But Japan, they went in a totally different direction, like full isolation mode.
It's pretty wild, right? Well, while Europe's out there colonizing everything, empires like Russia and China are expanding. Japan's like, nope, we're good.
Thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah.
It's called Sakoku, right? This isolation period.
Sakoku, yeah. And it lasted for over 250 years. Crazy to think about the impact that had on them.
Before we get into that, I'm just curious, what was Japan like before all this, before the 15th century?
So imagine Japan. They're connected to Korea, China through trade, cultural exchange, but pretty isolated from Europe. So they developed this unique blend of influences.
I see, yeah.
Buddhism, for example, it really took off in Japan, even more so than in China. And they took Chinese culture and kind of made it their own.
Interesting. So what changed? What made them go into isolation mode?
Europeans showed up. Specifically, the Portuguese. Mid-16th century, that really shook things up. They brought new trade, yeah. But also, something the Japanese leaders saw as a big problem, Christianity.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic. New religion comes in, everyone freaks out.
Exactly. They were worried about, their authority being undermined, rebellions, that kind of thing.
So at first, they were probably excited, right? New trading partners.
Right.
And then they're like, wait a minute. This could get messy.
Exactly. And that fear of outside influence, especially religious influence, that's what led to the persecution of Japanese Christians.
Yeah.
And eventually to Sakoku.
Sakoku. It sounds so, I don't know, final. Like, did they really cut off all contact?
Pretty much. Almost all foreign contact and trade banned.
Wow.
There was one exception, a tiny Dutch trading post way out in Nagasaki Harbor, away from everything important. Smart.
It was all about control. Keep things from disrupting their society.
It seems kind of counterintuitive, though, right?
Yeah.
Cutting themselves off like that, wouldn't that hurt them, like their economy or their technology?
You'd think so, right. But that's what's so fascinating about this period. By shutting everyone out, they actually created this amazing environment for their own culture and economy to flourish.
Really? So while everyone else is out conquering and colonizing,
Yep.
Japan's just chilling, working on themselves.
Basically. No international drama, no wars. They could just focus on their art, their writing, their economic systems. They refined things, innovated, took inspiration from China, but made it their own.
I love that. So what kind of stuff are they doing culturally? I mean, think about it. Refinement, innovation. Buddhism was still huge, but it evolved into these distinctly Japanese forms like Zen Buddhism. New art forms popped up. Kabuki theater, for example. Super dramatic, elaborate costumes, all male casts. And their economy was booming. Especially with crafts and ceramics, they even developed a pretty sophisticated system of trade and finance all within Japan.
It's amazing. Like, they turned inwards and created this whole vibrant world.
Yeah.
And all this was happening under the Tokugawa Shogunate, right? They came to power in 1600 after a bunch of fighting.
That's them, the Tokugawa Shogunate. They brought peace and stability for sure, but they were also very strict, all about control and order.
Okay, so what were some of their big policies?
Well, first, they banned guns.
Guns, why?
Keep the samurai in charge. They were all about swords and bows, so no guns. Then they doubled down on the social hierarchy. Samurai at the top, then farmers, artisans, merchants.
Super rigid.
And of course, they kept sakoku in place, no foreigners.
So a very controlled hierarchical society, but one that was really good at protecting its traditions.
Yeah, and they had this interesting system of government. It was like a dual system. You had the emperor, but he was more of a figurehead, didn't have much real power. And then you had the shogun, the military leader. He was the one calling the shots.
So like the emperor was the face of Japan, but the shogun was the one running things behind the scenes.
Exactly. And the shoguns, they had some clever ways of keeping the powerful daimyo, those regional lords, in line. One of the best, the Senkin Kotai system.
Senkin Kotai. I've heard of it, but I don't really get it.
Okay, so picture this. Every other year, the daimyo had to go to the capital, Edo, modern-day Tokyo.
A visit with the boss.
But here's the kicker. They had to bring their families and their wives and kids. They had to stay in Edo even when the daimyo went back home.
Wait, so their families were basically hostages?
You got it. It kept the daimyo from getting too powerful or rebellious. Plus, all that traveling back and forth, all those fancy houses in Edo, it cost a fortune, so it kept them financially weak too.
Wow, that's some next level strategy.
It worked. So even though Japan was isolated from the world, there was still a lot of power play going on inside.
Makes sense.
And it's important to remember, even in this super strict society, things were still changing. The samurai, for example, no wars to fight, so they started taking on these bureaucratic roles, more intellectual stuff. And the cities, Kyoto, Osaka, Edo, they were growing. New ways of living, new ways of doing business.
It's like even when you shut out the world, society still finds a way to change.
Exactly. And all this peace had a huge impact on Japan. Their art, their literacy rates, their culture, it really shaped who they became.
So Japan created this amazing culture by cutting itself off. Totally unique. It's kind of inspiring, actually. But, I mean, how long could that last?
Good question. That leads to the end of Sakoku, and that's a story for another time.
It's amazing, right? Russia, China, Japan, they all had these similar challenges, but they came up with totally different answers.
It shows you there's no, one right way to build a successful society.
Yeah, like what worked for Russia wouldn't have worked for Japan.
Right.
Right. I mean, Russia was all about expanding and control.
Yeah.
Japan went the opposite way.
Exactly. And even within those strategies, things were always changing, like the Ming Dynasty, right? They did great at first, but then internal problems, threats from outside.
Empires are fragile.
Totally. Doesn't matter how powerful you are, things change. Inside, outside, time just keeps moving. You got to adapt. It's a balancing act.
So what can we learn from all this? Like, what can we take away and apply to, today's world?
That's the big question. And I think one of the biggest things is context. What worked for one empire might not work for another, or even for the same empire at a different time. There's no magic formula.
We can't just copy them, but we can learn from them.
Right.
What are some of the big lessons you see?
Well, strong institutions, super important. Like China had their scholar officials, a really effective bureaucracy. The Tokugawa Shogunate had that dual government system. Checks and balances, If you want to be stable, you need strong institutions to manage everything, enforce laws, deal with crises.
Makes sense.
Another big one is balancing freedom and order.
Yeah, that seems to be a theme.
Right. Every society struggles with that. Too much freedom, things fall apart. Too much control, people can't be creative. It's about finding that sweet spot,
Right, where everyone can thrive. But that's got to be hard to do.
It is. And then there's the whole adapting to change thing. We saw it back then with globalization starting. And it's even more important today, right?
Definitely.
Technology, economics, politics, everything's constantly changing. You got to be able to keep up. If you cling to the past, you're going to get left behind.
It's like balancing tradition and innovation.
Exactly. And every society has to figure out how to do that dance.
This is why I love history. It's like having a conversation with the past. These empires, their stories, they make us think about our own choices, our own challenges. How are we going to deal with this crazy world?
I love that. History isn't just dates and names. It's like a reflection of ourselves, our struggles, our potential.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive. Russia, Japan, China, the Ming Dynasty. Wow.
We covered a lot.
We did. Thanks for joining us. And we hope you learned something new today, something to think about as we all try to figure out this ever-changing world. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep learning.